The first truck arrived shortly after sunrise. She heard the engine before she saw it, a deep mechanical growl breaking the silence of the farm. When she reached the fence, several more trucks were already moving down the newly widened road, their tires covered in thick red clay. None of them stopped at the farmhouse. One after another, the trucks reversed toward the eastern field, lifted their steel beds, and released tons of wet earth. Clay, mud, gravel, and broken road material slid down in heavy waves, swallowing the grass beneath them. She ran toward the workers, waving both hands. "Stop! This is private property." The nearest driver pointed toward the road supervisor. The man barely looked up from his clipboard. He explained that the excavated soil had to be removed from the construction zone. According to a temporary land use agreement, the low field beside the road had supposedly been approved as a disposal site. She had never agreed to that. By noon, nearly half of the eastern field had disappeared beneath the mud. It was not the richest part of the farm. During wet springs, water often collected there, and crops grew unevenly, but the field still produced enough hay to help feed her animals through winter. More importantly, her family had worked that land for decades. Now it looked like a wound carved across the farm. The clay settled into a dense, airless layer. Tractor tires sank into it. Water gathered in shallow pools. Grass vanished beneath the weight, while the few plants still visible bent under the mud. By evening, the trucks were gone. The silence they left behind felt heavier than the noise. She stood at the edge of the field with mud clinging to her boots. Removing the material would require machinery she did not own, and money she could not afford. Everyone who saw the damage offered the same advice. Call a lawyer, sell the farm, leave before the problem becomes worse. But as the sun dropped behind the trees, she noticed something unusual. The rainwater was not spreading randomly. It followed the new ridges, collecting in certain areas while draining quickly from others. The road crew believed they had left her with ruined land. She was not yet convinced. The next morning, she called the road department before the office had officially opened. She explained what had happened, gave them the location, and demanded that the dumping stop. The woman on the phone listened politely, then transferred her to another department. That department sent her somewhere else. By noon, she had spoken to 4 different people. Each gave her a different answer. One said the crew had followed the approved construction plan. Another said the dumping area had been marked by a subcontractor. A third claimed the material was only clean soil and would not harm the property. No one admitted responsibility. That afternoon, the road supervisor returned with a folder of documents. He showed her a copy of a temporary access agreement signed months earlier, when the county had requested permission to work near the boundary of her farm. The agreement allowed equipment to cross a narrow strip of land. It said nothing about burying a field. She pointed this out, but the supervisor only shook his head. "The disposal zone was added to the site map," he said. "You'll have to take it up with the county." The county told her to contact the contractor. The contractor told her to speak with the engineering office. The engineering office said any formal complaint could take months to review. Meanwhile, the clay was already beginning to harden. She called a local excavation company and asked how much it would cost to remove the material. The owner visited the farm, walked across the damaged field, and studied the deep tire tracks. His estimate was devastating. The job would require heavy machinery, dozens of truckloads, and a legal place to dump the soil. The total cost was more than she had earned from the farm in several years. When her neighbors heard the number, they stopped talking about repairs. They began talking about selling. One told her that no crop would grow through that much compacted clay. Another warned that standing water would bring insects, root disease, and more erosion. Even her brother said fighting the county could consume every dollar she had left. For the first time, she wondered whether they were right. She stood at the kitchen table that evening, surrounded by estimates, maps, and unanswered letters. Outside the window, the eastern field had turned into a dark, uneven mass. The road crew had created the damage. The offices had created the excuses. And somehow, the cost of fixing everything had been left to her. 3 days later, rain returned. It began softly before dawn, tapping against the roof in a steady rhythm. By mid-morning, The eastern field had disappeared beneath a gray curtain of water. She expected the worst. From the kitchen window, she watched rain strike the clay and gather in dark pools. The new surface looked sealed, as if nothing could pass through it. Every warning she had heard seemed to be coming true. Still, she pulled on her boots and walked outside. Mud gripped her feet with every step. In some places, she sank nearly to her ankles. The air smelled of wet soil, crushed grass, and fresh roadwork. At first, the field looked completely ruined. Then she noticed the water was moving. It did not spread evenly across the clay. Thin streams followed the ridges left by the trucks. Some channels emptied toward the old drainage ditch, while others curved around the higher piles of soil. She stopped and watched closely. One section near the fence remained almost dry. Another held water like a shallow basin. A narrow strip along the tree line was receiving moisture without flooding. The field had changed, but it had not become lifeless. Near one of the raised ridges, a few blades of grass pushed through a crack in the clay. Farther down, a cluster of weeds had survived beneath a thin layer of mud. Their leaves were bent, but still green. She knelt and scraped the surface with her fingers. The clay was thick and sticky on top, but beneath it, she found darker soil mixed with roots and decaying plant matter. The road crew had covered the land, but they had not erased everything underneath. For the first time since the trucks arrived, she felt something other than anger. She felt curiosity. The ridges were redirecting water. The low areas were storing it. The surviving plants were showing her where air, moisture, and living soil still remained. She returned to the house, found an old notebook, and drew a rough map of the field. She marked every puddle, every dry strip, every place where water moved, every plant that was still alive. The others saw mud spreading across a ruined field. She was beginning to see a pattern. The next morning, she returned to the field carrying wooden stakes, colored ribbon, a shovel, and the notebook she had started the day before. This time, she was not searching for another sign of life. She wanted proof. She placed a stake wherever the ground dried first. Blue ribbon marked the places where water remained longest. Red ribbon followed the narrow channels carved through the clay by the storm. By noon, the ruined field was covered with markers. From the road, they looked scattered and meaningless. But when she stepped back, a pattern appeared. The highest ridges released water quickly. The deepest section near the road held it like a basin. Along the old tree line, the soil remained damp without becoming flooded. Near the drainage ditch, runoff moved fast enough to cut grooves through the new layer of mud. The trucks had changed the surface. They had not changed the direction the land naturally wanted to drain. She began testing each area with her shovel. In the lowest section, water seeped into the hole almost immediately. On the ridges, the clay was firmer and several inches drier. Beneath the surviving weeds, fine roots had already found cracks in the compacted soil. The field was not one dead, uniform mass. It contained several different conditions. Some areas needed to release water. Some needed to be raised. Some could hold storm runoff. And some might support trees if their roots remained above the wettest clay. That last thought stayed with her. Trees did not need the entire field to become perfect farmland. They needed protected root zones, controlled water, and enough living material near the surface. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine rows of fruit trees where the trucks had left only mud. She drew raised planting beds across the higher contours. Between them, she added shallow channels to slow and guide rainwater. In the deepest corner, she marked a small holding basin. The plan was still rough. She did not know whether it would work. But by sunset, she was no longer drawing a damaged hayfield. She was drawing an orchard. For the next week, her kitchen table became a planning desk. She spread out hand-drawn maps, soil notes, rainfall records, and every photograph she had taken after the trucks left. The more she studied the field, the clearer the idea became. She would not remove the clay. She would reshape it. The highest ridges could become planting rows. The lowest areas could carry and store water. Instead of forcing the entire field to drain at once, she would guide the water slowly through the land. Her first step was to mark the contour of the slope. Using stakes, string, and a simple level, she traced lines across the field where the ground remained at nearly the same height. Along those lines, she planned shallow channels that could catch runoff before it rushed downhill. The clay dug from the channels would not be wasted. She would pile it on the downhill side to build raised mounds. Those mounds would become the foundation of the orchard. By lifting the planting area above the wettest ground, she could protect future tree roots from standing water. The channels below would collect rain and release moisture gradually into the surrounding soil. At the deepest corner of the field, she planned a small holding basin. It would receive excess water during heavy storms and provide reserve moisture during dry weeks. The design looked simple on paper. Building it was another matter. She had no large excavator and could not afford to hire a crew. She borrowed a small tractor with a rear blade, used a shovel where the machine could not reach, and worked section by section. The clay resisted every move. When dry, it broke into hard slabs. When wet, it clung to tools and tires. Some days, she completed only a few yards before exhaustion forced her to stop. Her neighbors watched from the road. One asked why she was making the ruined field even more uneven. Another joked that she was building graves for trees that had not yet been planted. She ignored them. By the end of the second week, the first raised row stretched across the field. Beneath it ran a shallow channel connected to the old drainage ditch. Then rain came again. She stood under the porch and watched the water reach her new channel. Instead of spreading across the entire field, it slowed, turned, and followed the path she had created. For the first time, the damaged land responded to her plan. The orchard existed only as lines of clay and wooden stakes. But it had begun. The raised rows solved only one problem. They lifted the future roots above the wettest clay, but the mounds themselves were still dense, sticky, and nearly impossible to plant. She needed to build soil on top of them. Buying enough compost for the entire field was far beyond her budget, so she began looking for materials others no longer wanted. The first load came from a tree trimming crew working several miles away. They delivered chipped branches, shredded leaves, and small pieces of bark that would otherwise have been hauled to a disposal site. A nearby stable allowed her to collect old bedding mixed with manure. A neighbor gave her spoiled hay that had become too dusty for livestock. In autumn, she gathered bags of fallen leaves from homes along the county road. None of the materials looked valuable on their own. Together, they could become something the clay lacked. She spread coarse wood chips directly across the raised rows, creating a protective layer between the exposed soil and the sun. On top of that, she added thinner layers of manure, hay, leaves, and partially finished compost. She did not mix everything deeply into the clay. Instead, she let the layers rest on the surface, where rain, fungi, insects, and time could slowly begin the work. The change was not immediate. During the first hot week, the clay between uncovered sections dried into hard plates and split apart. Beneath the mulch, however, the ground remained cooler and slightly damp. After another rain, water no longer struck the surface with full force. It filtered through the loose organic material before reaching the clay below. She began noticing small signs. White fungal threads appeared beneath pieces of wood. Beetles moved through the damp leaves. A few worms appeared near the older manure, even though none had been visible when she first examined the field. The orchard still looked nothing like an orchard. There were no trees, no blossoms, and no fruit. There were only dark rows of decomposing material crossing a landscape of red-brown clay. But beneath those layers, a new surface was beginning to form. The road crew had left her with mineral soil that held water but lacked structure and life. She was now adding the missing half. Not by buying perfect soil, by collecting what everyone else had discarded. By early spring, the raised rows were ready for their first trees. She chose a small number of young fruit trees rather than planting the entire field at once. Apples went on the highest mounds, pears along the drier edge, and several plum trees near the center, where the soil stayed moist without remaining flooded. For the first few weeks, everything seemed to work. New leaves opened, Buds formed on several branches. From the road, the rows of young trees finally made the damaged field look like the beginning of an orchard. Then, the heavy rains arrived. For 4 days, water fell without stopping. The shallow channels filled quickly, and the holding basin rose almost to its edge. Although the system slowed much of the runoff, several planting mounds began to soften and collapse. Water gathered around the roots of the lowest trees. Within days, their leaves turned pale. One plum tree dropped nearly all its new growth. 2 apple trees leaned as the wet clay shifted beneath them. When she dug beside one of the weakest trees, a sour smell rose from the hole. The roots were sitting in cold, airless mud. She had raised the trees, but not high enough. The organic layers had improved the surface, yet beneath them the compacted clay still prevented excess water from moving away. In several places, the planting holes had acted like bowls, trapping water directly around the roots. Her neighbors noticed the yellow leaves. One of them shook his head and said the field was proving what everyone already knew. Trees did not belong there. For one long evening, she believed him. She walked between the rows, counting the damaged trees and calculating how much money she had already spent. Months of digging, hauling, layering, and planning seemed to be disappearing with every fallen leaf. But the failure was not the same everywhere. The trees on the tallest mounds remained green. Those planted near the tree line were growing slowly but steadily. Only the trees in the lowest, most heavily compacted sections were failing. That difference gave her an answer. The orchard idea was not wrong. The design was incomplete. She marked every damaged location in her notebook. The mounds needed more height. The channels needed greater capacity. The planting holes needed a way to release trapped water. The first planting had cost her several trees, but it had also shown her exactly where the system was weakest. The next morning, she began removing the weakest trees. It was painful work. Each one represented money, time, and hope. But leaving them in waterlogged holes would not save them. She examined every failed planting site before filling it back in. The pattern was clear. The lowest mounds had settled too much. Several channels were too narrow to carry heavy rainfall. In some places, the planting holes had been dug directly into dense clay, creating pockets where water could collect with nowhere to escape. She changed the design. First, she rebuilt the planting rows, adding more clay and organic material until the new mounds stood well above the surrounding field. She widened the shallow channels and connected them more carefully to the old drainage ditch and holding basin. Then she stopped digging deep planting holes. Instead, she spread the roots across the upper part of each mound and covered them with a mixture of compost, aged manure, leaves, and loosened soil. The trees would begin near the surface, where oxygen was available, and grow downward only as the soil improved. She also changed the trees. Rather than choosing varieties only for flavor or popularity, she looked for rootstocks known to tolerate heavier soil and short periods of excess moisture. She planted replacement trees only in the areas that had proven they could support them. Between the rows, she sowed deep-rooted cover plants. Their roots would enter cracks in the clay, protect the surface from erosion, and leave behind small channels when they died. She also planted grasses and low-growing legumes to cover bare ground and provide more organic material. The work moved more slowly now, but it was more precise. She no longer treated the entire field as if every section were the same. The wettest corner remained a water storage area. The highest ground received the most sensitive trees. Tougher varieties went into the heavier sections. When another storm arrived, she walked outside before the rain had even stopped. Water filled the widened channels, but did not spill across the planting rows. The taller mounds held their shape. The replacement trees stood above the saturated ground, their roots protected from the deepest mud. Nothing about the orchard had become easy, but for the first time the system did not collapse under pressure. She had stopped trying to force the land to obey her original plan. Now the plan was beginning to obey the land. By the following spring, the field no longer looked abandoned. The rows were still uneven, and the young trees were small, but green growth now stretched across land that had once been buried under clay and mud. The first sign appeared beneath the mulch. When she pulled back a layer of old leaves and wood chips, the soil underneath was darker than before. It no longer broke into hard plates. It crumbled between her fingers, carrying the rich smell of decaying wood and living earth. Worms moved through the damp material. Fine roots spread beneath the surface. The soil was beginning to build itself. The cover plants between the rows had also changed the field. Their roots held the raised mounds together during storms, while their leaves protected the clay from direct sun. When she cut them back, she left the plant material on the ground to feed the next layer of growth. Then the trees began to respond. The surviving apples produced strong new branches. The pears along the drier edge opened clusters of white flowers. Even the replacement plums, planted on higher mounds, held their leaves through weeks of rain. Not every tree grew at the same speed. Some remained thin and cautious. Others stretched upward as if they had finally found the conditions they needed. But the widespread yellowing had stopped. The roots were no longer drowning. After one heavy storm, she walked the entire orchard and found no standing water around the trunks. The channels were full, the holding basin had risen, and the clay beneath the rows was saturated, but the trees remained above it. The system was working. Later that season, a few branches carried their first small fruits. There were not enough to sell. Some dropped early, and others were damaged by insects, but she carried the best apple into the kitchen, cut it open, and placed the slices on a plate. It was small and slightly misshapen. To her, it was proof. The field everyone had called ruined was now supporting trees. The clay was holding moisture. The organic layers were feeding the soil. The channels were guiding the rain. Nothing had changed through a single miracle. The orchard had come alive through dozens of small corrections, each one based on what the land revealed. From the road, her neighbors could now see rows of green where they had once seen only mud. The orchard was not finished, but it was no longer an experiment. 3 years after the first truck entered her field, the orchard produced its first real harvest. The trees were still young, but their branches now carried enough apples, pears, and plums to fill wooden crates across the barn floor. Some fruit was small, some was uneven in color, but it was healthy, flavorful, and grown on land everyone had once considered ruined. She began by selling a few baskets at the local market. Customers were drawn to the story as much as the fruit. They wanted to know how an orchard had grown from a field buried under road clay. When she explained the raised rows, water channels, mulch, and years of careful adjustment, people returned with friends. The following season, a small restaurant placed a regular order. Then families began visiting the farm to pick fruit directly from the trees. The orchard created more than income. Because the clay held moisture beneath the organic layers, the trees needed less frequent watering during dry weeks. The holding basin captured storm runoff, while the channels distributed moisture across the field. Leaves, grass cuttings, spoiled hay, and wood chips continued to feed the soil. What had once seemed like a useless mass of mud had become part of a working system. One afternoon, a county vehicle stopped beside the field. 2 engineers stepped out to inspect a drainage problem along the widened road. One of them had seen the property shortly after the dumping and recognized the field immediately. He stared at the rows of fruit trees, the green cover between them, and the water moving slowly through the shallow channels. "This was the disposal area, wasn't it?" he asked. She nodded. He walked farther into the orchard and pressed his boot into the dark soil beneath the mulch. The clay was still there, but it was no longer exposed, cracked, or lifeless. The material the road crew had abandoned had become the base of the orchard's water system. She had not forgotten the damage or the years of unanswered complaints. The dumping should never have happened, and the people responsible had never truly repaired what they had done. But they had also failed to decide the final value of her land. That decision had remained hers. By autumn, the trees stood heavy with fruit above the same clay that was supposed to destroy the farm. The disaster had not disappeared. She had transformed it into the foundation of something stronger.